My wife and I are outdoorsy people. Our first date was a picnic in the middle of the woods. Our wedding was in my parents' backyard, which is almost surrounded by forests. This matters because this story begins and ends in a forest. Late summer of 2014, it was one of those moist kind of summer days. My lady and I went on our weekly stroll or hike through a forest near our home. About 3/4 of the way through, she noticed a pile of hair, wire-like hair. Of course, we didn't touch it, but we didn't know what to do. It was clearly hair from a person's head, not an animal or anything, but other than that, we didn't think much of it. The next week we went back, but this time the hair was gone. In the place was a letter, clearly had just been placed there, as if someone was waiting for us. The letter read, "Why did you ignore me?" I told my wife it was just trash, but obviously she didn't believe me, but knew she would be better off. Early summer of 2015, nothing had happened ever since. I wish it would have stayed that way. We walked around the same area that we made our discovery. We never really talked about it. If it did come up, we would joke about it, saying that Brittany was at it again or something. Anyway, at this time my wife is about 4.5 months pregnant. So we just took an easier path to walk. About halfway through our walk, I heard a whimper to my right. I looked and there was this woman, about in her early 40s. She was dirty, as if she had rolled in dirt for days. She was holding onto a tree, digging her mostly broken or numbed fingernails. I took my wife's arm and led her behind myself, and I asked, "Ma'am, are you alright? Do you need me to call someone for you?" She replied, but I couldn't make out what she said. "Pardon? Why?" She started vomiting what looked like black mud. I motioned my wife to start walking away while I stayed back to make sure she didn't follow or chase us. She didn't hesitate to start walking off. Knowing she was pregnant was most likely the reason, but when the woman noticed my wife walking away, she charged at us. Unknowing of her strength, I didn't prepare to be pushed down. I fell onto my back and she was on top of me. She tried to scramble up while staring in the direction my wife was now running in. I tightly wrapped my arms around this woman and she started vomiting onto my forehead. She tried screaming, but she would just choke. Once she had finished, she screamed, "Why did you ignore me?" But I was too engaged in the idea of how the fuck am I going to get out of this. I started to wiggle to try to get myself on top of her, but once I did, what next? Stand up, shake hands, and leave? No. My face was right on her upper chest, so I couldn't just whip my face into hers. I got my arms out from under her, and I used them to hold her arms down, and I lift myself, almost like a push-up. Then I press my foot-filled boot onto her stomach, then I mentally count to 5, then I accidentally kick her chin with my other foot-filled boot, and I take off. I look back at her, gripping her jaw and reaching for me while screaming. It's amazing how fast a person can run when they feel like they could die. I dodged every rock and tree. I even went off the trail just in case she ever got up and ran for me. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I meet the edge of the forest and the side of the road. Our town is half a forest. I look left to right, no wife to be seen. I ran to her car and she wasn't anywhere to be found. I leapt into the driver's seat and started screaming and pulling at my face, punching the wheel and stomped. I leaped into the driver's seat and started screaming and pulling at my face, punching the wheel and stomped. Then I heard crying and screaming in the back, and it was the love of my life, laying on the seats holding her ears and knees to her chest, or as close as they could get. I pulled myself back there so fast I don't even remember, and I hugged her so fucking tight she smacked me off because of the vomit on my head. We did not call the police because this experience caused my wife a lot of stress and sleepless nights that she had a miscarriage, and we chose to forget. We do not go on walks that aren't by roads or buildings. It's been 5 years since then and we have 2 beautiful boys. We never saw this woman again, and I hope we never do. I was sleeping over at my friend Jacob's house in September of 2015 with another friend of ours. Jacob lives very far out of the way next to a lot of forest land in northeast Pennsylvania. Now I do not get frightened too much anymore, but I have always been creeped out by the barren woods around his house at a very young age. The story begins at around 11 o'clock at night with the three of us hanging out in the large field that stretched for about 800 yards from Jacob's house to the thick woods. We got bored out there after a while and decided to go back to the house. When the three of us were about 200 yards away from the house, we looked back to three bright red road flares scattered far apart from each other in the field. We were not very scared at first because we thought it was Jacob's 18-year-old brother and his group of friends that were also over that night playing a prank on us. We walk a bit further to see that Jacob's brother and his friends were hanging out by the house, so there was no possible way they could have lit the flares. His brother, along with his friends, began asking us why we lit flares up in the field, and we explained that we thought it was them who did it. Well, the next thing I know, the whole field was lit up with spotlights and car headlights from all of the 18-year-olds and Jacob's dad. Whoever the trespassers were, they had put very sharp pieces of scrap metal, almost like they were trying to sabotage us if we would come after them with any kind of vehicle to pop the tires. The group keeps saying that they were seeing multiple silhouettes of people running along the edge of the high grass field and the woods. One of the 18-year-olds, Joe, went chasing after one of the trespassers, which he had seen sprinting in the woods. He had lost the guy, but what he had brought back with him still sends chills down my spine. Joe brought back a potato with a very sinister face drawn on it that he said he found on the ground. Time passes and Jacob's dad tells Jacob and I to stand up on the tree fort that their family had built with a spotlight. The tree fort was about 35 yards into the woods and was lower to the ground yet wider across. We were standing up there scared shitless, searching the woods with the spotlight. About an hour passed and we all decided to end the search. When we all began driving back to the house, Joe once again saw a shadow, but get this, he saw two shadows that came directly underneath the tree fort then ran off. This time Jacob's dad went to go check it out because he saw the figures as well. 15 minutes later, his dad came back with a strange look on his face. He did not see the vandalizers, but brought back something that made me want to pass out. A second potato with an even more evil looking face on it that he found underneath the tree fort. The stalkers that were on the property were feet below me and my friends for nearly an hour. Now, to some people, this would just be a normal case of pranksters. Believe me, it was more than that. The question I ask myself to this day is what the hell were a group of very stealthy people doing on a large property in virtually the middle of nowhere? Even if it were just the very few neighbors that live nearby, they are all in their older years and would not have the desire nor stealth to pull this prank. I also wonder how stealthy the group of trespassers must have been to not be seen by our whole group with vehicles and spotlights. We didn't even see their bodies at all. All we ever got to see of them were their shadows and the horrific traces they left behind. Lastly, the reason I say group is because there had been 3 road flares that had been lit on opposite sides of the field at practically the same time. There had to have been at least 3 of them in a group that night. The story takes place in America in the early 1980s before my mom was married. She lived with her sister's husband, and their 3 dogs. My mother's family is from Ireland, and so is my aunt's husband. His sister, Mary Catherine, was visiting the States for a few weeks. During the daytime, everyone worked, so it was just Mary Catherine at home with their 3 dogs. Princess, a German Shepherd standard collie mix, Kelly, a German Shepherd Husky, and Mickey, a massive illegal wolf mix. All 3 dogs were big hams but fiercely protective. One day, my mom came home from work to find the lights turned out, shades drawn, and doors locked. She thought maybe Mary Catherine had gone for a walk, but when she opened the door, she met Mary, standing white as a sheet with a knife in her hand. "Oh, Patsy, something terrible happened today. We had a visitor," she spoke. Around noon, Mary was in the kitchen fixing herself some lunch when she heard the front door open. The dogs went crazy, howling and barking. The dogs never barked at family, so she went to see who it was. It was a man. A man she had never seen before let himself in through the unlocked door and was sitting on the couch. The dog stood on the staircase landing adjacent to the couch and refused to go near him. Before she could ask who he was, he said, "I'm very thirsty. Could you get me a drink of water?" She figured he was just a neighbor, or maybe his car had broken down. The house was situated in a remote and relatively safe area, so she didn't think of him as a threat. Plus, she was from a small village where she knew everyone, and unexpected guests were the norm for her. He sat on the sofa so casually, like he was waiting for someone. She said hello and went into the kitchen to get him a drink, ushering the dogs in with her to avoid making a fuss. They were very angry, growling at the man with their hackles raised, but they hadn't approached him. She had her back turned at the kitchen sink, filling up a glass of water, when she felt a hand clap on her shoulder. "Are you waiting on someone? The family won't be home for a while," Mary said nervously. "I know they won't," the man replied coldly. Mary whipped around to face the man. "You know," he said, "you're a good-looking woman, and I'm a good-looking man." The dogs backed up against her, barking and howling. She reached behind her to grab a knife off the block in one hand and the glass of water in the other. "I think you should drink your water and be on your way." The man stood and drank the water while Mary stood there with the dogs. She watched him place the glass on a table, open the door, go down the steps, and walk into the street until she lost sight of him. Once everyone was home, my mother called the police. There wasn't much they could do since Mary wasn't hurt and they hadn't heard any reports of break-ins or assaults lately, so they just took a statement. My family always tells this story as an example of how the Irish people tend to downplay unfortunate situations almost humorously. The Irish comedian Tommy Tiernan calls this a fundamental darkness that the Irish people have. We laugh at the blackness in life, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Had that man been watching the house to know everyone's schedule, knew that Mary wasn't from around here, and was going to use that to take advantage of her? Or was he just a wandering creep looking for unlocked doors? So I lived in the same house for about 10 years or so when this happened. Now I live at a dorm, and quite a few scary things happened to me and my sister as we shared a bedroom. We're only 3 years apart and both girls. She also didn't like to sleep alone at that time, like most kids. Well, about 5 years into living into that house, my sister was about 10 and she was at the top bunk of our bunk bed. In the middle of the night, she suddenly screamed and I woke up asking what happened. She said she looked over the bunk bed rail and saw a figure in white, a female, walking around. For the sake of keeping her calm, I told her it was me getting up to get a drink. She accepted it and went back to sleep. It wasn't me. Since then, nothing happened until we moved into a different room in the house, switching rooms with our parents since they were putting down new carpet. After that first week, I started getting woken up in the middle of the night from different things. Some of them were just something smacking my bed, like with a large book. Several times I woke up with someone whispering into my ear. I would hear things fall to the floor, but in the morning nothing had. There was only one time I ever saw anything, and I believe it to be a different, spirit than the one that woke me up all the time. It was standing over my bed, and for the few seconds I saw it, I saw my grandfather who died when I was 10. This was kinda weird, but I was almost expecting it, as 4 other people in my family had seen his spirit, and my grandmother thinks he's watching over us and keeping bad away. I screamed, and after that I stopped being woken up in the morning by whatever until it came back for a few months. But there were fewer incidents. Ever since I moved to my dorm room, there's been nothing, which is good. The only noise I hear is the person next door getting ready for work at 3 in the morning. And now, since my sister has taken over my bed at home, because there was a spider on hers and my bed was more comfortable, I've been sleeping in the guest/game room, my older brother's old room. I haven't had anything happen to me. Still, just thinking about it makes me freak out. It's early November, cold, rainy, around midnight. My fiance and I like taking spontaneous late night drives. We typically start out on one of the main roads within our city and keep following it until we hit the next town. Sometimes our drives last hours. The layout of my county and the surrounding counties is a little bizarre. All of the cities and towns are isolated by large spreads of woods and country. I live in a relatively large college town, but a half-hour drive in one direction can land you stranded on jagged, unmarked gravel roads in the middle of nowhere, or in small, weird villages that no one knows about. It's actually pretty exciting, and that's why we do it so much. So it's midnight, and we're nearly lost. Willa, my fiance, is poking around on my phone trying to figure out what road we're on. We're on a mud path in a pit of country framed by small towns that we've never heard of. Flory, Winka, and Tell or something. There are no other cars on the road. It's rainy and misty, and the headlights on my car aren't doing a damn thing. There are stands of trees and brush on either side of the road. We're heading north. She tells me that she thinks we're going to cross 200th Street West, which runs into Rye Road, which is a straight shot to Winka. We make our way down the mud road for a half an hour and never hit it. We've always had fun on these sorts of drives. It's really the first time we've ever been on edge. Willa says we should have found 200th Street West already, and asks if we passed it without noticing. I ask nervously if we should turn around, but she doesn't think we can without backing up into a tree or ditch. I'm driving a Mazda and it has an awfully wide turn. She's biting her nails while scrolling around on Google Maps. 10 minutes pass and we finally see a little black road snagging up a hill, branching off of the road we're on. I hurriedly turned into it. It's very narrow and twigs and branches are raking the doors and windows of the car. When we complete the climb up the little road, we find ourselves in a wide paved clearing with a house at the back of it, tucked into the thick woods. Willa doesn't miss a beat and starts hissing for me to turn around. Our headlights illuminate the whole property, which is in a major disrepair. No lights, windows shattered, siding and shingles shredded. The yard is littered with scraps and trash. Barrels, car parts, tools, hundreds of glass bottles, branches, slabs of concrete, rocks, nasty old Chevy pickup. It looks like the house is sitting on top of all of it. Every inch of the property is entangled in nets of ivy and weeds. Willa points out little moving shadows and glowing spots around the yard. There are dozens of cats around and they're all looking at us and their eyes are glimmering from the headlights. I almost piss myself when a walnut-sized rock darts out of the brush and pops against the windshield. It fractures the glass. Willa screams and she grabs my arm. She's whimpering, "Denny, what was that? Oh my god, Den, what happened?" The rain is pouring in black streams down the trees, over the house and across the pavement. All of the blood runs from my face. After a few seconds, a man stumbles out from the bushes and weeds and he's been carrying a fucking shovel. He's swallowed in a big dirty navy coat and has a beard. Then a screen door on the house opens and all the cats scatter. A tall, thin, spidery woman crawls out onto the porch. She has long, wild gray hair. She's just up high enough on the porch that the headlights don't reach her eyes. She wipes her unusually dark hands on her skirt. I have no clue what was on her hands, but that's what I remember the most about her, how dark her hands were, and stares at us. Willa is screaming and crying, slapping the door lock repeatedly. I throw the car into reverse, rolling over cinder blocks and branches, then screech back down the road. After Willa stops crying and there's some distance between us and the house, I start to relax. Yet, when we get out of the woods and hit a long straight stretch of road, I notice headlights behind us. I get a stomachache when I notice the car is mimicking all of our turns onto different roads. After nearly half an hour of being pursued, we finally reach Flory and pull into a gas station being visited by a few other people. I watch the vehicle pass. It's the same nasty Chevy truck we saw at the house. They stalked us all the way to the next town. We wait till we see the truck disappear down the road before we get out, get some food and ask for directions. On our way home, I look at the rearview mirror more than I did at the road ahead. When we get back early in the morning, my teeth don't stop chattering until I fall asleep. So creepy shovel guy and dirty hand cat witch, let's never meet again, ever again, thanks. When me and my family first moved over to Los Angeles from Mexico, most of the houses we could afford were in the Compton area. So we looked around until we found this yellow, decrepit looking house that was a decent sized and pretty affordable. The owners were two sisters who were in their mid-70s to 80s. Before the purchase was made, I asked them about a picture of them with another woman. They told me that the other woman was their other sister, who had very bad hallucinations and was put into a mental hospital. I found that quite unnerving, but just went along with my parents' excitement and happy to finally have a true home. After a few weeks of getting settled in, a woman who no one knew would come by and just stand outside of our gate and just look at the house. One day, my mom invited her in for some coffee, and that's when she explained that she was the sister who was put in the mental hospital and that she was let go for good progress and behavior. After that, she became pretty close with my family and soon became like a good family friend. But in the following years, we noticed she started coming by less and less, until one night when everyone was asleep, I woke up to my brother in my bed shaking me. When I asked him what was wrong, he whispered to me, "There is a witch outside of the window." I told him to stop being dumb, and that's when he told me he had to cover the window with the curtains. Then we heard banging on our window and followed up by a smash. Now at the time we had half of the window covered up by our mirror so that no one would be able to get in. But we saw this so-called witch trying to get in and we noticed she had a knife in her hand. It wasn't until I saw her face that I grabbed my brother and I ran with him to my parents' room. My dad thought we were being stupid until he heard screaming. She was yelling at the top of her lungs, "Get the fuck out of my house, you fucking beaners, I'm gonna kill you." My dad then grabbed his gun and shot a bullet into the window. He yelled that if she tries anything, he won't hesitate to blow her head off. My mom called the cops and we waited. They arrived in 10 minutes and they found her in the bushes waiting for us to get out. When they arrested her, we realized that it was the sister who was in the hospital. We also found out she was covered in blood from killing one of the neighbor's dogs. To this day, I have realized that maybe she was starting to have hallucinations again and must have thought her old house still belonged to her. After that, we ended up moving to a small house in Downey, but if there's one thing that I will never forget, it was her face. She looked not only out of it, but completely insane. This is a bit of a long story. There are 3 of us. We'll call them Nate, Brandon, and Jay. I'm Nate, and the story will be told from my perspective of the experience. So it's the beginning of the 9th grade. School started about 2 weeks ago. It's early September, so it's a Friday night. My friend Brandon and I were extremely bored just sitting at his house playing Halo Reach and Super Smash Bros. Melee. So it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Neither of our parents were home. Mine were on a business trip. His just worked really late. So we headed on our bikes to get Subway sandwiches for dinner and bike around the neighborhood for a little bit, seeing if some of our other friends can hang out. We end up giving up and going back to Brandon's house around 7 p.m. and I get a call from my friend Jay, who goes to a different school, asking if Brandon and I wanted to go sleep over at his place that night. We said yes, and we were happy we had something to do. So Brandon got his stuff together, stopped by my house to feed the cat and grab my stuff for the sleepover, then headed over to Jay's house. We get to Jay's house, we go swimming in Jay's pool, play basketball, Xbox, street hockey, you know the stuff teenagers do. We had a great time. So then I remember I had some coupons for buy one get one free shakes from Sonic in my wallet. For any of you who don't know, Sonic is a drive-in restaurant that has amazing shakes. So we decide to bike on over there. It's about a 5-mile bike ride, and by the time we get there, it's 11:15 p.m. And this wasn't one of the Sonics open 24/7. This one closes at 11:30 p.m. So we arrived just in time to get 2 medium banana shakes and 1 medium caramel shake. So we hang out and get the shakes, and it was about 11:25, and Jay's dad texted us that we needed to be back by 1:45, which was far past curfew for our age. So we had over an hour till we needed to be back, so we decided to bike along the trails and around the neighborhood. First mistake. It was actually a pretty calm night, actually pretty relaxing. It was a good temperature, cool 60 or 65 degrees, and a nice breeze. So as we're riding around the paths, we end up accidentally making a wrong turn. Second mistake. After 20 or 30 minutes of biking, we realize we are completely lost in a forest, so we stop. Third mistake. So after we stop, we turn on our flashlights on our cell phones to look around the forest to see if we recognize the area. As we're looking around, Brandon turns around and screams as his light shows up on 3 or 4 men with nightmare-inducing facial expressions. Jay and I look back, we scream. The scary men scream and they let out a freaky laugh. And we take off on our bikes as fast as our legs could carry us. We were never 100% sure if they chased us or not, but we were going too fast to notice and we didn't want to risk slowing down to look back and have a chance of getting caught by them. As we get out of the forest on the streets, we pass a traffic light, and the street sign said Route 55, which was almost 10 miles away from our house, and we didn't know how we ventured out that far, but at least we knew how to get home from there. The only words that were uttered from us till we got back to Jay's house were, "Turn left here." We didn't see any cars on the road on the ride home, so we assumed that if they were following us, that we lost them. Every time a car passed by, we were worried it was them, but as we got closer and closer to the house, we saw less and less cars. Jay lived on a street that went up a hill and had a cul-de-sac on the top of the hill. Most of the houses were pitch black on the street. When we got home, we immediately checked to make sure all the doors and windows were locked just in case. We then scrambled upstairs to Jay's room and sat in a circle on the floor in complete silence. Then Brandon broke the silence by saying, "Nate, Jay, what the hell just happened?" The three of us are still really good friends to this day. We never saw the people we saw in the woods that night again. It's been a few years since then, but one thing's for sure, the three of us will never forget that experience. Before I begin my story, I'd like to say that I'm a male and I'm also in high school. On Fridays after school, my friends and I usually go to Starbucks just to have fun and mess around a bit. However, during this time, my friends had plans of their own, leaving me to hang out by myself and drink my coffee alone. About an hour into my relaxation, my mom had called to meet me at Starbucks to hang out and talk about usual things that a mother and son would typically talk about. By the time she arrived, things were pretty crazy. The weather was beginning to turn ugly and a lot of people were rushing inside to get warm food and drinks. One of the people, a very well-dressed lady, sat right next to my mom and I. She began saying something like, "You guys can come to my house and get $1 million," or she would say, "You guys get an A+. From the sound of it, we could easily tell she was mentally ill, so we decided just to go with the music and play along with the conversation she was having with us. About a few minutes in, shit started to get pretty crazy. The lady began talking about how she used to be a teacher and that she was fired from her job because someone tried to murder her. The way she talked about this was really disturbing. Eventually, she left without a trace and we hadn't seen her for a while. About a few days later, one of my friends and I were hanging around the same area and spotted the lady talking to people. She said the same crap to me and my friend, but we took it in a kind gesture, only because we knew how to deal with her. We decide to chill for a bit when we see cop cars pull up near the downtown grill. Apparently the lady had gone in and started saying to some young girl that she was the chosen one, and that she was going to her house to get $1 million. The lady was said to also act violent towards the employees serving food, usually pacing towards them in an aggressive manner. The police dealt with her and are taking the lady to a mental facility. All I know is that she was mentally ill, and even though she seemed harmless and would hopefully never hurt anyone, it was still disturbingly eerie to know what was going through her head. I grew up in a house with most of my family, which a lot of them claimed was haunted, but until my late childhood, I never believed a word. Until the night I fell asleep in my mom's bed. To start, I'm an adult now, in my late 20s. I live with my wife-to-be in Canada. The story I want to tell happened when I was 9, I think, and I've never really talked about it. It's not terrifying, but super creepy. My family moved a lot within my city when I was a kid. It was my mom, my grandma, my baby sister, and me. My mom worked nights, she's a nurse, and normally wasn't home until 8 or 9 in the morning. My grandma at the time was in remission from lung cancer. She was an insomniac, so even though she had a room, she normally stayed up in the living room watching late night Law and Order reruns. Anyways, on this night my mom agreed to let me fall asleep in her room, as young kids are allowed to do. She had a pretty comfortable bed, and my grandma was in the living room as usual if I needed anything. I was pretty tired, so I fell asleep pretty fast. I should probably mention I'm a hard sleeper. My family jokes that I sleep through a hurricane. I've never had night terrors or anything like that, which makes this harder to explain rationally. My mom went to work right after I went to bed, gone for the night to her job. I could hear the Law and Order theme playing as I dozed off, so I knew where my grandma was. I slept pretty well until I woke up to a sudden, heavy weight at the end of the bed. My eyes flashed open quickly, but at first I wasn't too worried as I thought maybe my Grams was coming to check in on me and rub my back, grandma kind of stuff, until I heard her cough from the living room. I froze, my head under the covers, refusing to move them, thoughts running. Was my mom home early? No, if it was my mom, she would move closer or lay down beside me, not sit at the end of the bed, seemingly just staring at me, no words. Was it my little sister sneaking out of her room to sleep in my mom's bedroom? No, the weight was too much, too heavy, like a grown adult. Then I started to feel uneasy, unsafe. The weight wasn't moving, just felt like it was sitting there, watching me, knowing I was awake and could sense it there. I wasn't willing to move. I barely breathed just to hope it would go away, but it didn't. For what seemed like hours, but was probably mere minutes, the standoff continued, me hiding under the covers, it sitting there. Stoic, unnerving, intimidating, until finally the weight lifted and went away, taking the sense of dread with it. I was feeling drained and exhausted, and that led to me finally blacking out back into the safety of sleep, waking up just in time to hear my mom come in the front door. This story has a semi-long intro, so please bear with me. In the year 2013, I was a sophomore in high school in Southern California. I had earlier that year moved to a city called Menifee, which is mainly a suburb for the working folk in the Riverside County. Anyways, while I was a new kid, I was still able to make a couple of friends pretty quickly. I'm changing their names for anonymity reasons. Let's call them Bradley, Jacob, and Austin, Bradley being my closest friend among the three to this day. I remember it being on a Friday during that year's fall season. They all happened to live on a cul-de-sac, which was about over 1.5 miles from where I lived. Since my neighborhood consisted of elderly people, I usually spent my time over at theirs, at around noon till late the very morning the next day. Well, the day of my story's occurrence happened to be one of those days. Frankly, I don't remember what actually we did that day. All I remember was since it was a Friday, my mom allowed me to stay out later. When the time reached around midnight, my mom texted me and told me to come home as she was going to sleep. I would have asked my friends if their parents could give me a ride home, but unfortunately they were all fast asleep and I didn't want to bug my friends by asking if I could sleep over, so I gave my friends a farewell and headed home. 5 minutes into my journey, I actually didn't mind having to walk. The air was nice and cool, and I always loved the night sky. Between me and my friends' homes, there was an elementary school with a wide green flat park right next to it. The park having no lights and being totally pitch black. I was about to pass the park when I noticed a man sitting on a bench near the corner of the park close to me, about 100 feet away. I couldn't really see his face, but could decipher that he was a tall, bald, white guy in a black hoodie and shorts. Besides glancing at him once and taking in all those details about him, I didn't really pay much attention to him and continued on my way. I just kept walking forward, occasionally glancing at my phone for no particular reason. When I neared the lamppost near the sidewalk I was traveling on, I noticed that when I looked down in front of me, a second shadow opposite to mine was casted. I instantly thought it was someone else, that guy I'd seen earlier most likely being the caster. I quickened my pace while trying not to make it too obvious to get some distance between me and whoever was behind me. Now, some people probably wouldn't mind or care if they had to share the sidewalk with a stranger, but since it was late at night and I'm a pretty scrawny guy, I didn't want to risk getting mugged. Eventually, I decided to cross the street. I looked both ways for cars, but obviously it was to see who was behind me, and sure enough, it was the same man. It was a little brighter due to there being lampposts, and I quickly got another look at him. He was built and about 6 feet tall. After I crossed, I continued down my same route, but shortly after, I noticed that the guy had also crossed the street and was once again right behind me. Okay, now I was starting to really freak out as my heart began to beat faster. Up ahead, the street, which connected into my neighborhood, was within sight. At first, I felt relieved, but then I realized that I didn't want the guy to follow me home and know where I lived. Instead of turning into my street, I continued walking forward until I approached another street coming off the main road. I quickly sped up and turned in, and once I knew I was a little out of sight, I began to jog away quickly. When I was like 100 yards away from the mouth of the street, I twisted my head around to clarify if the man had continued following me. He was, and not just following, he was full on sprinting. And at that moment I decided, fuck it, and also began to sprint away. I didn't even know where I was running at that point, or which new street I was running into. I just had to get away. After running for a while, I ended up thinking of the idea to run to the side of the house that actually had 2 trash bins next to it. I laid flat on my belly and faced the street. Luckily for me, I had been wearing a black jacket, so hopefully I was able to blend into the darkness around me. I laid there for a minute when this guy happened to stop running on the sidewalk near where I was laying. He stood there and scanned the area around him really fast. My heart stopped when he looked my way. When he couldn't see me, he continued running in the direction he'd been facing. I waited there for 5 more minutes so that he would be long gone. Afterwards, I bolted straight home, but it still took me half an hour. I never told my parents about that experience since we had finally settled in and I had made my own group of friends and didn't want to risk moving again. The event itself slowly faded from my mind until recently. My only precaution was to never walk home at that time again. I never found out who that guy was, but in the years following, I discovered that in the early 2000s, the local high school had a neo-Nazi problem, but had since been rooted out. I'm not positive that's why he ran after me, but it does seem possible that a white supremacist wouldn't mind roughing up a smaller Latino in the middle of the night with no one else around. I was about 3 years old at the time. My brother was 5. Our parents were going through a divorce, so my grandparents offered to look after me and my brother until the divorce was final so that we weren't caught up in the mess. My grandparents' anniversary was coming up, so my grandmother thought it'd help our mother take her mind off things to spend some time with us so she could relax. She and my grandfather went out for the evening and left me and my brother home with our mother for the night. Things seemed to be going good at first, nothing out of the ordinary. It was starting to get a bit late and my brother and I were sitting on the living room floor watching television. After a while, she asked if we had heard anything, and I remember we both looked at her and she had this worried look on her face. She muted the television for a moment to listen, and we started hearing noises coming from our basement. It was the sound of our bathroom door in our basement swinging open and closed again. It sounded like someone had just walked into the bathroom and slammed the door. But that couldn't be possible, seeing as how me, my older brother, and our mom were the only ones in the house at the time. Mom dismissed it at first, reasoning that the house was just old and old houses usually make strange noises. So we went back to watching television again for a while. After about an hour or so had passed, it was around 8 o'clock, almost time for my brother and I to go to bed. Mom muted the television again and told us to be quiet. We listened for a minute and didn't hear anything at first. Then after a while, we began to hear the sound of pounding coming from the basement just under the living room floor. It was soft at first, but as it went on, it got louder and louder. The sound encircled the living room almost like a shark circling in on its prey. It got closer to where my brother and I were sitting as it circled around us, growing louder and louder until it finally sounded like someone was banging on the living room floor under us with their fists, trying to break through the floorboards. Me and my brother jumped up onto the couch and huddled ourselves close around our mom, who was curled up on the couch and was just as scared as we were. The sounds of the pounding slowly subsided. Mom frantically dialed the restaurant where my grandfather said he and our grandmother would be. After a while, my grandfather picked up and asked what was wrong. Mom told him what we were hearing. My grandfather is still a firm skeptic. He doesn't believe in ghosts. He told her it was probably just the pipes rattling and that she was just under a lot of stress from the divorce and her imagination was running away from her. He then told her to be sure to have us in bed by 9 o'clock and he would see us in the morning, and he hung up. A few minutes went by and we were still huddled together on the couch. Mom did her best to stay calm and hold herself together for me and my brother, saying that Granddad was probably just right. It was an old house after all. So we just went back to watching television, trying to take our minds off of the situation before we had to go to bed. I'm not exactly sure what happened next, but a strong feeling of fear came over my mom as she turned off the television. I could see it in her eyes as my brother and I both looked back at her. We sat there in silence for only a moment. The air was dead quiet. Then the banging started up again, louder than ever. It sounded like someone was frantically trying to break through the floor in a fit of rage. Mom picked up the phone and dialed the restaurant again, but the phone wasn't working. She picked us up both from the floor and pushed us into the main hall and ran to the kitchen to get us our coats from the chair at the end of the table next to the basement door. Suddenly, me and my brother both heard what sounded like a set of heavy combat boots stomping up from the basement stairs and a hair-raising slam against the basement door. It sounded like whoever or whatever was down there wanted to get out. We then heard a tumbling noise as if someone had thrown a chair down the basement stairs. Mom didn't waste a second in getting us the hell out of the front door. She practically threw us outside, and we spent the rest of the evening in her car until our grandparents returned home. Our grandmother's car finally pulled into the lot at the top of our street, and my grandfather saw that we were sitting in our mom's car, and he got angry. He demanded to know why we weren't in bed before they returned home. Mom told them everything. You could just tell by the way she spoke that she was shaken. My brother and I confirmed everything she said, but our grandfather had none of it. He went up to the locked room on the second floor and grabbed a pistol from the gun cabinet and demanded my mom follow him to the basement so that he could show her that there was absolutely no one else in the house. But she refused to follow him into the basement. Of course, after checking everything over, nothing was found to be broken, so there couldn't have been anyone else in the house. Our grandmother didn't need convincing. She had always believed in ghosts. She had stories of her own encounters with the paranormal. But either way, Mom never spent another night in her grandparents' house alone after that. To this day, she refuses to stay after dark. My brother is 30 now and I'm 28. Our grandmother has since passed away and our grandfather's health hasn't been what it should be. So I stay with him and I look after him. To this day, I don't know who or what was in our basement that night. I hope I never find out. But every time my grandfather asks me to go down in the basement to get something for him, I always get the feeling that there's someone watching me down there. And every time I go down there, the bathroom door on the far side of the basement is always open, no matter how many times I close it. Every time I go down there, that goddamn door is always open. A little update on this story. I've looked into the history of my grandfather's house where this event took place. As it turns out, several of the previous owners had died on the property. One person had a heart attack and died in his sleep in one of the bedrooms on the second floor. A second person had died of a blood clot in her brain in our living room. And the third, being the original owner of the house when it was first built in 1911, had fallen down the basement stairs and broke his neck against the wall of the foundation. Could this have been him in our basement? I was around maybe 16 or 15 and my mom and I were visiting this friend whose name I can't remember, but for this story, I'll call him Bill. Bill lived out in this real old log cabin at the very edge of these old woods. It was around 11 o'clock at night. I was dead tired and my mom was driving through the woods. She had an extra gas tank in the back part of the car because it was a really long trip. I fell asleep and woke up to this loud crash when my mom was putting gas into the car. It freaked me out. My mom told me to stay in the car because it sounded like a loud gunshot crossed with a lion roar that came from a real pissed off person. She finished filling up the car and grabbed the flashlight, thinking it was someone stalking us, because this was the middle of the woods and who knows what else could pop up. I heard a noise I couldn't even describe afterwards, and my mom never heard it. She came back around 5 minutes later and she was clearly freaked out, but even to this day she won't tell me, but I know what it is. The paranormal is quite normal for our family. We're used to weird stuff, but those woods, imagine lost woods from Ocarina of Time crossed with Suicide Forest with a dirt road. At that point, I'm too tired to even ask what freaked her out, so I go back to sleep. I wake up around maybe 4 in the morning and we made it to the cabin. Bill is this guy that can best be described as a man-bear standing 6'4" and built like a wall. The most friendly guy you will ever meet. A gazebo was in the front yard, made out of pure walnut that he handcrafted, and beyond that were more woods, and beautiful sight where the lake just reflects off everything. We chat it up and have a fun time. He makes us this stew that is to die for. We're all relaxing by the gazebo around 11 at night. Normally I'd have gone to bed, but this was summer vacation so I was allowed to stay up. I start seeing these things, which I can only describe as red brooding eyes, and they were in the woods. But it was still too far to be certain. Bill ran inside to get his gun, and we follow him into the woods. The eyes disappear and it got freezing cold, like walk-in freezer cold. The flashlight goes out and I got sandwiched between Mom and Bill, and what happened afterwards still scares me. We all hear, "Where are my babies?" and this loud shrieking scream, and I can see this long black-haired woman who had no eyes and was just torn in a white blood-stained robe, just running like a linebacker right at us. At this point, I literally wet myself screaming. Bill fires his shotgun. I'm bawling my eyes out and my mom is hugging me like a small child. It starts to warm up after that, and we all went back to the cabin. We were all hysterical. Bill locks the door tightly and was shaking so hard that he could barely hold his gun. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night after that. To first start off, I lived in a medium-sized house and shared a room with my brother. The room had a window on the right side looking into my backyard. The room was ground level. It was the last week we were living in the house after about 8 or 9 years living there. During the beginning few days of the week, strange things started happening like tapping, creaking, etc. Me and my brother weren't really fazed by it as the house was pretty old. About 4 days into the week, I woke up in the middle of the night with my TV on to static. I turned my TV off and went back to bed when suddenly I was woken up when I heard something outside. I saw a dark figure walk past my window. Me being a kid, as this was quite a while ago, I was frozen in fear and didn't move a muscle. After about 15 minutes of petrifying fear, I realized my brother was awake too, and him and I ran to my parents' room. They told us it was nothing and to go back to bed, so we did. The next day at about the same time, I woke up to the sound of water running in my bathroom. I got scared shitless but had to stand up and turn the water off. As I got to my bathroom and turned the faucet off, I saw the same figure I had seen the previous night staring at me through the small window. I remember its piercing eyes to this day. It was dark, so I couldn't really see its body clearly, but it looked almost human besides the fact its eyes were a glowing white color that felt like it was piercing into my soul. I bolted out of the bathroom, woke my brother up, and gunned it upstairs to my parents' room. My dad was pissed that we woke him up again, so he decided to check out what was outside himself. He was horrified at what he saw on the camera. The cameras caught a glimpse of a black figure walk into frame right before all the cameras went static. My dad didn't want to call the police as they would have thought he was insane trying to explain there was a monster stalking his kids. The next morning, I asked my brother if he woke up and anything happened to him in the nights prior to what happened, and he said he had woken up but not seen anyone or anything. The next couple of nights were eventless, but we kept alert to make sure nothing happened in the night. It was the final night before we moved out. I was woken up yet again, but at the exact same time as my brother. It was as if we were in sync. The creature was directly outside of our window staring at us with its white eyes. My brother screamed as loud as he could and our dad ran out with a gun and shot the figure. Right before he shot, the figure punched the window, leaving a shattered fist mark in the window glass. The figure ran around the corner of the house, leaving no blood trail and no evidence besides the broken window. My parents called the police and explained what happened. The police officer said there had been multiple calls with the same figure around the area. We moved out the next morning after trashing the broken window. We left the city never seeing the house or the creature again. Maybe it was something or someone that didn't want us to leave. But all I know is that I would never go back to that house again. I've always been into paranormal stuff, ghosts and whatnot. What happened to me took place on the week of Halloween in 2014. I remember being on a group call where we were discussing paranormal and creepy stuff, and this guy brought the Ouija board into the topic. Somehow someone dared me to set up a Ouija board and do it live with them. At first I wasn't really willing to do so because I'm easily spooked and I was all alone at home. Peer pressure kinda took me over and that's when I agreed to do it. So we read about the do's and don'ts and I set up the board. I light some candles, I turn on my camera so they can see what's going on, and I turn off the lights. It's pitch black in my room and I can already feel that what I'm doing is a mistake. Anyways, I start the seance. Mind you, I was very tired because it was early in the morning / late at night, and that's something that isn't really advised whenever using a Ouija board. I ask simple questions to begin with and nothing happens. Then comes the moment where I ask the name of the spirit. That's where stuff starts going south. The planchette starts to move so naturally I freak out, and so does everyone in the call. The planchette goes to P, then A, and ends with Z. It then stops and makes its way on the top right corner, then the top left corner, then the bottom left corner, and finally the bottom right corner. According to whatever we read prior to the session, whenever the planchette does that, it means that the spirit is evil and is actually trying to escape. That's where I decide to stop the seance, because at this point I'm really freaked out, and so are my friends. I manage to end it, but right after that I'm frozen. I cannot move and I'm focused on this white orb glowy thing in front of me. I can feel that I'm bawling my eyes out, but I still cannot move, and my friends are yelling at me, asking if I'm okay without getting an answer from me. After a few minutes, the orb glowy thing disappears. I regain consciousness and let my friends know that I'm fine. We then talk about what happened, and someone tries to search for the name Paz. After a few minutes, the orb glowy thing disappears. I regain consciousness and let my friends know that I'm fine. We then talk about what happened, and someone tried to search for the Paz name. It turns out it's the name of a demon entity called Pazu. At least that's what we gathered from it. After that, I ended the call and tried to get some rest and recover from what just happened. The next day, my friends tell me that her psychic medium friend came to visit her, and the first thing she mentioned was the seance we did the night before without my friend telling her anything about it. She said that it was indeed a good call to end the seance, and that the spirit was trying to get out and was no good. Now we're in October of 2015, week of Halloween, where we played with the board. At this point, I no longer speak to my friends because life happened. Anyways, throughout this whole week, I could feel something around me. Stuff would fall down without me touching it, and a lot of other stuff like that. I'm usually able to tell whenever a spirit or something paranormal is around me, but this time it didn't feel right or good. I kind of assumed it was connected to what happened the year before, so I decided to contact one of the girls who was with me that night, and she did tell me she felt the same way and stuff was happening too. Anyways, it's all over now, but it really was the scariest paranormal encounter I've ever had. I wouldn't advise anyone to mess around with a Ouija board. Now let me start by saying that, having spent my entire life living in New Mexico, a lot of people I know have claimed to see a skinwalker. They are kind of our regional boogeyman, but ask a Navajo about them and they will either absolutely ignore the question and all following, or they will kind of laugh it off saying something to the effect of, "Will white people believe they are myths?" Well, here's my story regarding them. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington, New Mexico. We deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for the large delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona on the Navajo reservation about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad gets the call for the job while he is chilling with his Navajo friend Mike and his girlfriend. Mike mentions how he's got family in Window Rock that he hasn't seen in ages and suggests that they go with him. I was about 6 or 7 at the time and it was summertime, so dad decides we'll all go down together. He can do his delivery really quick, then while Mike sees his family we can go and check out the Window Rock, big rock face with a large hole in it that goes to the other side. Pretty cool. We had to convoy in separate trucks since my dad was loaded down with freight. We decided to bring along some walkie-talkies so we could communicate with one another. We spend our time in Window Rock. Everything is generally uneventful and we start heading home along the old highway with my dad and I in front and Mike and his girlfriend in their truck behind us. I honestly don't remember most of the Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. We're somewhere on the highway between Window Rock and Gallup, New Mexico. It had just rained earlier in the day and the road was kind of slick, so we were taking it pretty slow. On the left side of the highway there is nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right there is a huge field separated from the road by a small barbed wire fence. We crest the top of this hill and down at the bottom of the hill we see what appears to be a very large dog, sitting back on its haunches in the middle of the road, facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio, "Hey Mike, do you see that big ass dog?" Mike starts yelling back over the radio, "That is not a dog, speed up and hit it." He almost sounds hysterical. He just keeps screaming, "Hit it, George, you have to hit it. Please, please, hit that fucking thing right now." So my dad starts to speed up, and as we get a bit closer, I can begin to see it a little more clearly. It's covered in this brown, wiry, matted hair that appears to have dried blood all over it. It's still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and looks at us, and it has a face. I don't know how to describe it other than a mix between a bear and a human's face. It looks twisted and distorted and almost in pain. As we get closer to this thing, we start to realize it's actually fucking huge. Though it's still sitting on his haunches, it is about shoulder height with the hood of the truck. We get literally inches from hitting it when it lets out this scream that sounds like someone screaming as their lungs were being filled with water, and it leaps backwards towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence. Then with another leap, it was gone from sight. Mike comes over the radio again. "Holy shit, keep driving. We have to get out of here. We have to go faster." He kept repeating that last part. "We have to get out of here and we have to go faster." Pretty soon we're speeding like crazy, and just as soon as we come near the outskirts of Gallup, we get pulled over. Mike pulls his truck over with us. Naturally, this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asks why Mike felt the need to pull over as well. Mike says, "We just saw a skinwalker a few miles back and it's been following us." The officer immediately turns white, stammers something about a verbal warning, gets in his car and takes off. We do the same. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Mike refused to let us leave without taking some kind of Navajo totem thing that was supposed to keep it away. So yeah, I guess that's my skinwalker story. Huge thanks to Because Skyrim for a near perfect representation of exactly what I saw that night.